The busy London street was bustling with people of all shapes and sizes, each trying desperately to get out of the torrential rain that was hammering down from the dark clouds above. The women's dresses dragged across the damp cobbles, and the men's shoes splashed through the many puddles as they marched through the crowds with determination. A short man with a big mouth was shouting something about vegetables as he swung a leek above his bald head, and a nearby woman had to duck quickly out of the way as it almost hit her in the face. CL and his butler Sebastian were attempting to wind their way through the crowd to try and get to the local cane shop. Finney had once again managed to snap the young masters when his temper had fled, and CL was due to meet with some businessmen later in the week. Without his cane, he felt like even more of a child. As usual, Sebastian followed closely behind his master, but he wished that, just this once, he could lead the way through the crowd. CL was too small to see past the taller adults, and he kept making turns that would lead him away from the cane shop, making their short journey much longer than necessary. The rain was getting heavier, and CL's teeth were beginning to chatter as the harsh wind raked icy fingers across his cheeks. As he forced his way through the forest of heavy dresses and rushing legs, someone knocked him sideways, and his tall hat fell to the ground, landing in a large muddy puddle. CL quietly cursed under his breath as Sebastian quickly retrieved his hat. Sebastian saw an opening in the crowd and gestured towards it. "Bocha, I believe that would be our best chance." CL followed his butler's gaze and wiped his soaked hair from his face. He nodded. "Yes, let's go." The young master started to walk towards the gap in the crowd. Suddenly his legs were swept from under him. He hit the cobbles with a loud grunt and gasped as someone accidentally kicked his side. A tall man in an expensive suit clicked his tongue at CL. "Bloody urchin." He stepped on CL's slender fingers and started to stride away. Sebastian's dark eyes widened, and he pushed the surrounding Londoners away from CL with enough force to push a few of them to the ground. He grabbed the tall man's collar, who had purposely stood on CL's fingers, and shoved him so hard that he felt something inside of the man snap. The demon knelt down beside his master, acting as a temporary umbrella for a moment, before he scooped CL up in his strong arms. The small boy tried to protest, but his body ached too much, and his head was spinning so quickly that it seemed as though the street and the people in it were flying around him rather than walking. CL looked up towards his butler's face, and saw that it was turned towards him with a look of, what, concern on it? Before he could dwell on the thought longer, the sounds in the street began to fade, and everything went black. A sudden warmth washed over CL, causing his eyes to flutter open slowly. He was back in the mansion, and by the looks on his servants' faces, he had only just arrived. Mirin's arms began to flap, and she began to speak, but Sebastian raised his hand. The other remained firmly under CL, so that he didn't fall from the butler's grasp. "The young master's had a mishap. I will take care of it." Without another word, Sebastian swept up the staircase and into the washroom. He carefully sat CL on the edge of the bathtub and began to inspect the young boy's injuries. CL suspected that he probably looked worse than he felt. He could feel a bruise forming on the left side, and his fingers ached, but everything else seemed minor. Sebastian removed his gloves and jacket and turned on the taps in the bathtub before touching CL's right cheek with no more force than the brush of a butterfly's wings. CL flinched, not because it hurt, although it did sting a little, but because he was not used to Sebastian being so gentle, or touching him at all for that matter. Sebastian immediately pulled his hand away. "Sorry, sir." He carefully removed CL's eye patch and then walked to the storage unit to retrieve some towels. CL's hair was still dripping, and he was shivering constantly as he sat on the bathtub. "If I may." Sebastian tugged on CL's coat, and the small boy held out his arms so that his butler could remove it. He then continued to untie the bow around Ciel's neck and undid the buttons on his master's shirt. He pulled off Ciel's boots one by one, careful not to jolt the boy too much, and finally removed his trousers. Ciel stood in nothing but his one-piece underwear garment, shivering and swaying slightly, and Sebastian swiftly wrapped a large towel around him, making sure it was nice and tight to keep as much warmth in as possible. With careful hands, Sebastian pulled the towel over the boy's head and began to dry his dripping hair. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" Sebastian asked as he continued to dry Ciel's hair. No. Ciel didn't want to seem weak in front of Sebastian and tried to stand up a little straighter. Unfortunately, Sebastian knew his master better than he thought, and he moved his hands from Ciel's head to his ribs. Ciel hissed through his teeth as the demon's hands moved across the sore area on his left side, and a wry smile spread across Sebastian's face. "I'm fine!" Ciel tried to slap Sebastian's hands away, but as his fingers collided with the butler's hand, he cried out in pain. Sebastian held the boy's tiny fingers in his own larger hand and examined them carefully. He traced each small digit with a feather-light touch, and then looked into his master's unmatched eyes. "These 3 fingers are broken." He tapped the 3 damaged fingers in turn, and, without taking his hand from Ciel's, pulled out a medical supply tin. He opened the lid with one hand and examined its contents. Inside there were some bandages, some rubbing alcohol, and some cotton swabs. Sebastian removed a bandage and tore it into a thinner strip before wrapping it around Ciel's fingers. Once they were bound, Sebastian pulled the towel off of his young master and started to walk around him as though examining a fine piece of art. "What are you doing, Sebastian? I said I'm fine." Sebastian ignored the boy's whining and, in one quick strike, tore off the boy's undergarment, leaving Ciel stark naked in the bright room. He flushed crimson and wrapped his arms around himself quickly. One accidental touch of his left side, however, caused a bolt of pain to shoot through Ciel's body, and he stumbled forwards awkwardly. Sebastian caught him gently and then turned him sideways so that he could inspect his injury. A large blue-purple bruise had started to fan out from his ribs down to his hip, and a small gash had opened up where someone's boot buckle had torn his skin. Demon held out a tentative hand towards the wound and felt the sickly, sticky sensation of his master's blood on his fingers. Ciel froze. Was Sebastian going to hurt him? Was the sight of his blood a step too far for the demon? His questions were answered quickly as Sebastian took a swab and the rubbing alcohol from the medical tin and began dabbing it into the wound. "Ah!" Ciel flinched as the alcohol stung his side and tears pricked his eyes. "It will be over in a moment," Sebastian cooed quietly as he wiped away the last of the blood. "There." Steam was filling the room as the bathtub became full with clean, warm water, and Sebastian gently threaded one arm underneath Ciel's legs and the other beneath his back. He lifted the boy up easily and lowered him into the steaming water, with as much precision as a heart surgeon. As soon as the water touched Ciel's open wound, he splashed around awkwardly and tried to use his arms to stop himself being lowered any further. "It hurts, stop!" Sebastian's eyebrows rose and he stopped lowering the boy. He simply stood with Ciel hovering a few inches from the water's surface, his arms and legs spread out like a cat refusing to take a bath. "Butcher, this will ease your wounds and prevent a chill occurring." As Sebastian spoke, he lowered Ciel another centimetre. "It is for your own good." As Ciel's limbs began to relax further, Sebastian took his chance and lowered the boy completely into the water. The butler flinched slightly as a look of pain played across Ciel's face, but the warmth of the water soon relaxed the young earl, and he lay back in it, enjoying the relief it gave him. With careful movements, Sebastian took a cloth and soaked it in the warm water before gently washing Ciel's back, shoulders and arms with it. He used long, slow strokes to ease the boy, and before long Ciel's eyes began to drift shut. When Ciel's breathing had slowed to a lower rhythm, Sebastian scooped him up carefully and dried him as best he could while still holding him. Careful not to wake the slumbering Earl, he dressed the wound on Ciel's side and pulled on his nightshirt. Then he carried him into his bedroom and placed him under the sheets, like a parent putting their child to bed. In a way, Sebastian did feel like Ciel's father. He had to protect him and teach him, and even put him to bed when necessary. He felt like more of a parent every moment he spent with the boy, and, if he was being honest with himself, he really didn't mind. Sebastian closed the curtains so that the last remaining light of the day wouldn't disturb Ciel's sleep, and turned to leave. It was almost midnight, and the butler of the Phantom Hive Manor was making his way to his master's bedroom to check on him. He didn't want to leave him alone for too long, in case his wounds began to hurt, or he needed something. He pushed open the door to Ciel's bedroom and stepped inside silently. Sebastian? Ciel croaked. Sebastian was startled a little to hear that the young boy was awake. Yes, my lord. Sebastian stepped back over the bed and knelt down so that Ciel could look into his eyes. Where are they? The boy's speech was slurred slightly, and his eyes were only half open as he looked at his butler groggily. Who, sir? Sebastian's eyebrows knitted together as he tried to fathom who Ciel was talking about. I can't. I'm cold. Ciel coughed slightly, which seemed to awaken him from his daze. His wide eyes squinted into the darkness, and the glow from his right eye gave an eerie look to his butler's face. Sebastian held out his hand and rested it against Ciel's forehead. It was burning. You have a fever. Ciel shivered slightly and turned his flushed face away from Sebastian. The boy then pushed forcibly on his bedsheets and forced them off of his body. He felt like he was on fire, and the wound of it running down the sides of Ciel's face, but he still shivered now and then as the fever toyed with his body. I thought you said you were cold. Sebastian cocked an eyebrow at Ciel, but got no response. I'll get you some water. Sebastian stood up and was making his way to the door when Ciel whispered something unintelligible. The demon stopped and turned to face him. Did you say something, Bochan? Ciel buried his face into one of his pillows and mumbled, Don't leave me. Sebastian's face went blank and his eyebrows rose. Don't leave you? He smirked a little. I'll be back in a moment. You need to have some fluids and— No! Ciel interrupted and turned his red face towards a rather shocked Sebastian. Take me with you. I don't want to be alone. He coughed again and another shiver racked his tiny body. Very well. The butler leaned towards Ciel and picked him up like a bride. His demonic eyes flickered in the dim light and he spoke softly into Ciel's damp hair. You know, it will be difficult to carry both a glass of water and you. Shut up, Ciel whispered as he clung tighter to Sebastian's shirt and rested his head against his chest. He noticed that a sort of sweet scent clung to the demon, something that smelt like burnt strawberries or dying rose petals. It wasn't a particularly offensive smell, rather an indistinct one that Ciel couldn't quite place. Sebastian carried Ciel through the halls and down the staircase before entering the kitchen. He lit some candles with a flick of his wrist and set Ciel down on the tabletop. Whilst looking around the small room, Ciel realised that he had only been in the kitchen a small number of times. When he was very small, he'd watched his mother bake a cake or two, but that was about it. He thought that he probably avoided the place now because of a certain chef who liked to blow it up every other day. Sebastian poured some water from a large jug and handed Ciel the glass. He drank it quickly and coughed a little as it caught in his throat. Better? Sebastian asked as he put away the jug and glass. A little. Ciel shivered and flinched as his left side tensed and pulled at his bandage. Sebastian stood in front of Ciel and placed his slender hand over Ciel's nightshirt where his injury was. At first it felt as though he was going to squeeze it and watch as Ciel squirmed like a worm in a crow's beak, but Sebastian didn't tighten his grip. He simply held his hand on the wound so that Ciel could feel the pressure but not be hurt from it. The young Earl placed his own sweating hands over his butler's and closed his eyes. It felt nice to have some human, well, almost human, contact for a change. He was tired of being so alone and yearned for someone to simply hold him like his parents used to. Sebastian cupped his other hand around Ciel's bruised cheek and smiled a genuine-looking smile. "You should get back to bed, my lord." Ciel nodded sleepily as Sebastian picked him up once again and carried him back to his room. With gentle hands that seemed more suited to a mother than a demon, Sebastian placed Ciel back into bed. He fluffed his pillows and pulled the sheets up around the boy's shoulders. "Sebastian," Ciel's large eyes looked up at him from the darkness. "Will you stay with me a while? I feel so cold." "Of course." The butler perched on the end of the bed and blew out the flames of the candles on the candelabra on Ciel's night table. "Sebastian, I'm cold." Ciel's tiny voice seemed lost in the darkness of the room. "Shall I get the fire going, sir?" Ciel didn't respond. Instead, he pulled back the sheets and patted the space next to where he was lying. Sebastian's eyes widened and he looked at his young master as though he had grown a second head. "Beauchamp?" Ciel rolled over onto his left side so that he was no longer facing Sebastian, but left the sheets pulled down. Sebastian smiled and sighed. "Very well." He removed his shoes, waistcoat and tie and climbed into the bed beside the young boy. After a few minutes he whispered, "Young master, I do believe it will be quite uncomfortable sleeping on that side of your body with that injury." Ciel mumbled something and then turned onto his right side. A look of relief seemed to wash over his flushed face as he closed his open eyes. In his sleep he began to shiver, and so, being the attentive butler that he was, Sebastian pulled the boy closer to him so that he could wrap his arms around him. He lay there all night as Ciel moved closer and closer to him, and in the morning, when the young Earl awoke, he was using Sebastian's upper arm as a pillow whilst holding tightly onto his shirt. For the first time in a long while, Ciel woke up with a smile.